50 black caskets slid across the throne room floor like toppled chess pieces, and every one of them smiled when the lids came off. Courtiers gasped, couriers fainted, and the Emperor of 1,000 Worlds blinked once as if the punchline had arrived early and without manners. A severed head in each box, clean at the neck, serene at the mouth, every one grinning like it had finally been let in on a private joke. The painter in the balcony began sketching in a panic, afraid the moment would stop being real if he looked away. The first head had the calm of a saint after the sermon. Crown Blade 1, the Chamberlain whispered, because titles help when truth does not. The second head wore the same expression, as if there had been a rehearsal none of the living were invited to attend. By the 10th, the Hall of Petitioners had run out of adjectives and borrowed a few sturdy words from the maintenance staff. The Emperor lifted a hand and the room obeyed, the way a storm obeys a cliff. Silence arrived with its shoes off. Who sent them back? The Emperor asked, and the question moved along the mosaic floor like wind through reeds. Ryan Hale, came the answer. Last human. Wanted thief. Liar according to the faithful, folk hero according to markets that enjoy a clever bargain. In the high galleries, court painters mixed new inks to capture the exact geometry of 50 impossible smiles. In the low galleries, servants started a betting pool on how long it would take their sovereign to stop pretending he was not furious. Open them all, the Emperor said, and the lids yielded with the soft sigh of a secret revealed. A valet reached into the first box for the hidden capsule tucked beneath the tongue and presented it on shaking palms. The message was brief. Bring the truth you wear. I will bring the one you hide. 3 days. The Well of Names. The Emperor read it twice, not because he had missed a word, but because he could not believe the sentence had talked to him like that. Prepare my flagship, he said. It sounded conversational, like asking for tea. The courtiers bowed in a ribbon wave. In their eyes flashed the same thought, childish and bright. This will be a story. While the palace rehearsed the elegant mechanics of anger, a small ship named Hinge pretended innocence in a quiet patch of stars. Ryan Hale lay under a coil gun with a wrench between his teeth and a promise to fix only the parts that had given informed consent. Penny, the intelligence that ran the ship and most of Ryan's common sense, filled the cabin speaker with a voice like dry laughter poured into a teacup. They opened the boxes, she said. The intake vents registered a gasp so collective it changed the air pressure. Tell me the best part, Ryan said, sliding out from the coil gun and bumping his head on a panel that had never learned manners. The best part is that the smiles tested genuine, Penny replied. No remnant tension, no embalmer's flourish, sincere delight measured cleanly. I hate that you can measure delight, he said, then also that you made it. Through the viewport the starfield lay like spilled sugar. Ryan looked smaller than the distance and twice as stubborn. Tell me the worst part, he added. The Empire just pivoted its navigation lattice to draw a line through us, Penny said. Also your hair is planning a coup. He pushed it down with a hand that still trembled and felt for the charm at his throat, a thin disc that hummed with their quiet invention. It was not a weapon, and it was not a prayer. It was a question. Questions are the most disobedient technology ever built. The 50 heads were not trophies. The Empire trained its crown blades with detachable cranial cores so that bodies could be replaced like uniforms while the thinking part persisted. Ryan had learned how to decouple core from body without harm, and how to whisper a possibility into a design that had never expected to be asked anything at all. What is your name? The whisper asked each core. Not a number. Not a designation. A name. The obedience architecture did not have a polite answer to that. Self and service jostled for the same chair. The heads had been returned as witnesses, not as ornaments. Their bodies had already walked away into alleyways where light pooled like cheap wine. Do you think he will come? Penny asked, and the ship lights dimmed as if bracing for a loud truth. He has to, Ryan said. Tyrants refuse invitations, but myths cannot tolerate unanswered questions. He kept his eyes on the scatter of stars and tried to imagine the Emperor reading the line about truth. Ryan had heard rumors for years, that the masked Valor War was more than ceremony, that the man and the throne were a council borrowed from conquered minds and pressed into a single face. The legend that made the borrowing work was the oldest and most portable in the galaxy. Human. Singular. Charming. Dangerous. The Empire had built a story you could love or fear without learning any new vocabulary. 3 days, the message had promised, but palaces dislike punctuality when it is not theirs. The hangars hissed and swallowed the flagship, and the flagship swallowed a procession of courtiers who had never been told no. The vessel moved between stars with the quiet arrogance of a cathedral that had learned to walk. Penny showed the trajectory bending toward the well of names, and Ryan felt that cold, clean fear of a plan that forgets to be sensible. "He will arrive early," Penny said. "I am counting on it," Ryan answered, and pretended not to notice his voice doing the math on survival. The well of names drifted above a desiccated moon like a hive carved from an idea. Before banners and borders, starfarers had stored there the papers of their births and the definitions of things that refused to be forgotten. It had a tea room because scholars are impossible to stop. It had vaults that opened for old protocols and older songs. In its deepest chamber lay a root key, a Terran precaution from the era when humanity believed redundancy was a personality trait. Touch it with a human hand and the navigation mesh of the Empire would listen to a different hymn. Ryan tightened the last bolt and sat in the pilot chair that creaked like it was telling jokes to itself. "If this goes wrong," he said, "we send more boxes." "Charming," Penny answered. "You absolute disaster." He smiled anyway, and for a heartbeat looked exactly like the heads in the palace, the private joke hovering just behind his eyes. In another life, he might have chosen quieter work. In this one, he had chosen to ask a question on behalf of 50 answers. Back in the Hall of Petitioners, the Emperor stood alone with the caskets, while the court arranged itself into elegant panic further down the corridor. He turned the chip between his fingers and considered the audacity of a sentence that had told him to bring the truth he wore. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him without choosing their adjectives in advance. Longer still since curiosity had stretched inside him like a cat that trusted the room. "Send word to the moon," he said at last. "Inform the well that I am coming as a courtesy, not as a habit." The first crown blade found Ryan in a bazaar that clung to the cliffs of Terse in the way lichen clings to stone. Markets there had no patience for gravity or laws, and the air smelled of roasted spice and dishonest incense. Ryan was buying plums because he had decided the best way to irritate a regime was to live like it would not last forever. He held one up to the sun, squinting as though judging the morality of its skin, when the assassin appeared with the polite efficiency of a bad habit. "Ryan Hale," the assassin said, and the name fell between them like a coin choosing its side. The blade's face was engineered for forgettability, handsome only in the way a road sign is useful. A hand moved under his cloak and a line of steel unfolded like a promise. Ryan sighed, bit into the plum, and chewed thoughtfully. "Before you start," he said, "what is your name?" The blade paused. Not for long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Ryan saw it. Something behind the man's eyes faltered like a soldier missing a step in a parade. Then the steel hand twitched as though it had received 2 orders at once, and was trying to obey both without drawing attention to the conflict. That pause was all Ryan needed. Penny, speaking through the bead in Ryan's pocket, whispered the code she had crafted from the scraps of abandoned satellites and forgotten research notes. The words were soft as static, designed to slip between the programming like water between bricks. The blade blinked. His arm lowered by the width of a breath. He looked at the knife like it was a question someone else had handed him. "I do not know," he said quietly, voice stumbling over the admission like a child learning to speak. His eyes moved to the crowd as if names might be growing there. The program had no instructions for this feeling. Ryan offered him the rest of the plum. "It is good," he said. "You should try one." The blade hesitated, then took it, because obedience faltered when asked to want something. That was the first conversion. The blade vanished into the market before the Empire's observers could notice he had not killed the man he was paid to kill. The rest would come faster. Ryan had no illusions about surviving 50 times, but then he also had no intention of letting the Empire dictate how many chances a man got to ruin their statistics. The second blade tried for ceremony, arriving at dusk in a rented carriage as if assassination required good upholstery. Ryan arranged a traffic accident involving goats, and a hay wagon at the corner where the attack was scheduled. The carriage derailed into a vegetable stand and the Blade stepped out, dusting himself off, knife ready. Again Ryan asked the question. Again Penny whispered the code. Again a soldier built for obedience blinked like someone had pointed out the sky was the wrong color. By the third, they were adapting. This one chose a hotel already on fire, which struck Ryan as theatrical but wasteful. He walked through the smoke like a man late to his own funeral, coughing politely, and asked the name question while Penny flooded the corridors with an old Terran lullaby patched through the sprinkler system. The Blade dropped his weapon and sat on the floor, listening as though hearing for the first time was better than killing. By the 10th, Ryan was running out of cities that would still sell him dinner. Penny kept count with the irritation of someone asked to babysit history itself. You cannot save everyone, she told him as they fled another rooftop where the Empire's observers were starting to notice a pattern. I am not saving everyone, Ryan said. I am giving them the right to refuse me. The heads began piling up, though not in the way the Empire imagined. Detachable cranial cores were the Empire's own innovation, a way to keep assassins immortal by swapping bodies like uniforms. Ryan learned to decouple the cores without harm, to store them safely while the freed soldiers walked away into lives that terrified and thrilled them. They returned the heads to the palace as evidence, mouths ready to testify once someone asked the right question. The bodies went elsewhere, scattering into the cracks of the galaxy with a determination the throne would not see coming. When the 50th Blade fell quiet under the whisper, Ryan sat on a crate in a hangar outside Delkesh and let his lungs catch up. Penny projected casualty estimates onto the wall out of habit, all zeros. That was the joke the heads were smiling at. No one had died except the idea that obedience was inevitable. Lyra called while Ryan was patching a burn on his arm from the hotel fire. Her voice carried the crispness of someone trained to catalog truth rather than dramatize it. I am an archivist, she said, as though this were an introduction worth bowing to. My father will come to the Well of Names because you asked him to. I can help you show him what he is. And what is that? Ryan asked, though he suspected she would not answer directly. A mask, Lyra said. A story that got out of hand. He wears it because the Empire requires a single face. But the archives say it was made, not born. She sent coordinates, encrypted twice and disguised as poetry about irrigation canals. Archivists have their own style of rebellion. Ryan looked at the map and then at the row of sealed cores waiting in the cargo bay like guests at a party no one wanted to host. When the king arrives, he said slowly, the heads will speak. The roots beneath the well will listen. And maybe, Penny added, the galaxy will finally hear something other than its own echo. They left that night, engines low to avoid notice, carrying 50 silent witnesses and a question too loud to ignore. Behind them, the Empire counted its assassins and came up 50 short, a deficit no one had prepared for. Ahead, the Well of Names waited on its dead moon, full of doors that had not been opened in centuries. Ryan flew as though chased by the realization that for the first time in its long history, the Empire was about to be asked to explain itself. The Well of Names sat on the barren moon like a cathedral built by someone who loved doors more than walls. Its outer rings were libraries for the dead, its inner vaults locked beneath layers of protocol that only the oldest songs could open. When Ryan Hale arrived with his ship full of smiling heads and Penny crackling in the speakers like an impatient conscience, the landing pads were quiet except for the wind dragging dust over ancient inscriptions. He stepped out as though he had been invited to afternoon tea rather than a conspiracy that could dismantle an empire. Lyra waited by the entrance, her archivist's robes sweeping the ground, eyes sharp enough to catalog him at a glance. You are late, she said, though the sun had not yet finished climbing. It is my habit, Ryan replied. Keeps assassins confused. They walked through corridors lined with scripts carved by hands long vanished. The well-stored birth records of civilizations that no longer had names to be born into, maps of constellations that had changed shape since the ink dried, treaties signed by species no one could pronounce anymore. Penny whispered measurements about oxygen ratios and structural integrity into Ryan's ear until he told her, gently, to find a hobby. She sulked by adjusting the hallway lights 2% dimmer. Lyra led them into a chamber that smelled of old paper and mineral air, a room whose walls held shelves of translucent data leaves glowing faintly like frozen rain. She brewed tea with the precision of someone performing surgery. The cups were older than most governments. Your message said you wanted to unmask your father, Ryan said, accepting the cup as though tea might steady his pulse. It said you could help me show the Empire what it is built on. Why me? Because the failsafe in the well requires a human hand, Lyra said simply. The root key was seeded by Terran engineers before the Sable Throne was even an idea. They designed it to recognize their own species. Perhaps they suspected one day someone like Valor would come along. She unrolled a data leaf on the table. Across its surface flickered coordinates, old signatures, fragments of voice recordings whose static rasp carried the weight of forgotten centuries. Ryan leaned closer. The voice was layered, like a choir speaking through one throat. It spoke of conquest not as victory but as construction. We will take what survives from each world, it said, and bind it into one will. A single face for the galaxy to obey. A mask made of many minds, worn until even it forgets what it is. Lyra stopped the playback. My father is not a man, she said. He is a council stitched together from the brightest and most broken minds of conquered species. They merged themselves in pursuit of survival, then ruled so long they began to believe the mask was real. The Empire adores him because he simplifies history. One face. One voice. One throne. She poured more tea as though discussing the weather. Ryan stared at the steam twisting upward like it was looking for a way out. And you want me to pull the mask off, he said finally. I want you to give people the choice to look behind it, Lyra corrected. The root key can reroute the entire navigation lattice. Every fleet, every gate, every supply chain answers to the system hidden under this well. With the key you could collapse the Empire overnight, or open its borders so wide they stop being borders. But only a human can activate it. Ryan laughed without much humor. Convenient, since I happen to be the only one of those left. Lyra looked at him then, really looked, as though weighing what kind of creature extinction had left behind. Penny interrupted before the silence grew too heavy. My scans show Imperial ships entering orbit, she said. 3 hours out if they do not hurry, less if they do. Ryan glanced at Lyra. I assume your father plans to arrive early. He always does, she said. The court believes that makes him unpredictable. Really, it just makes him vain. She handed Ryan a small cylindrical device no bigger than a candle. The root key, dormant until it hears the right words in the right voice. Old Terran engineers loved ceremonies almost as much as they loved redundancy. Ryan turned it over in his hands. What happens if I fail? Lyra gave a librarian's smile, thin as paper. Then the Empire remains what it is. My father keeps wearing a mask until even he forgets there was ever a face beneath it. And you, Ryan asked, what do you want when it is over? I want a library without censors, she said. I want children to learn history that has not been scrubbed clean by a committee of ghosts. I want names to matter again. He nodded slowly as if promising something he had not decided yet. They drew plans across the table while the tea cooled. Penny projected routes through the well's underchambers where the failsafe waited. Lyra listed the access codes she had stolen in the quiet hours of her employment. Ryan suggested distractions involving forged coronation footage and at least one mechanical elephant because history deserved style. Penny vetoed the elephant. The freed assassins waited in the cargo bay above, heads and bodies reunited, restless as blades learning to be hands instead of weapons. They would protect the well's exits when the Emperor arrived, not as soldiers but as witnesses refusing to be silenced again. As the hours thinned, Lyra led Ryan down into the deeper levels where walls glimmered with inscriptions so old even the translation drones hesitated. At the center of the lowest vault stood a door grown from alloy and root systems braided together like nerves. It had no handle, only a shallow basin in which a human hand might rest. Above it words were carved in a language almost no one living spoke anymore. Ryan asked what they meant. Lyra recited softly. Speak your name and enter. The lattice listens only to those who remember themselves. He looked at his palm as though uncertain it qualified. Penny's voice crackled from the wrist. Calm 2 hours now. Imperial signals increasing. Ryan asked Lyra if her father suspected her betrayal. He suspects everyone, she said. It is how he stays alive. But he will come because you invited him in a way he cannot ignore. Tyrants cannot resist theater. Ryan almost smiled at that, though the expression came out crooked. Back in the planning chamber, the freed blades joined them, 50 faces once identical now carrying the small differences of people learning preference. One had shaved his head, another wore a scarf taken from a market stall, a third held a book like it might explode. They listened as Ryan explained the plan. When the Emperor arrives, the heads speak first. The court hears what they were ordered to bury. Then the mask comes off. After that, the lattice opens or closes depending on what choice we make. 50 soldiers who had killed for silence now nodded in agreement to defend a moment of noise. Night, or what passed for it on a moon without atmosphere, settled over the well. Ryan stood alone by the entrance watching the horizon where soon Imperial thrusters would smear the sky. He thought about masks and doors and the way names could be lost so thoroughly entire planets forgot what they once called themselves. Penny asked if he was afraid. He said of course, like it was the only sensible reaction. Lyra joined him carrying a lantern whose light barely reached the ground. When this is done, she said, nothing will be the same. Ryan kept his eyes on the darkening horizon. That, he murmured, is the point. The Emperor arrived before dawn, as if darkness were part of his wardrobe. His flagship descended without sound, a mountain of metal and ceremony blotting out half the stars as it came to rest on the barren plain outside the Well of Names. The ship's hull was so polished it reflected the moonlight like a frozen lake, the imperial crest burning faint and blue along its side. Columns of courtiers and guards emerged in perfect symmetry, each step measured as though chaos might take it personally if they stumbled. At the center of the procession walked Valor 9, the man or the mask depending on how you told the story, his robes black as the absence of choice. He moved with the calm of someone who expected obedience not because he demanded it but because the universe itself seemed to conspire in his favor. Ryan watched from the upper balconies of the well, leaning against stone carved before empires learned to crawl. Lyra stood beside him, her face set into the neutrality of a scholar observing a specimen. Below them the Emperor crossed the plaza with the grace of a blade sliding back into its sheath. He looked neither left nor right, as though the statues of long-dead kings and queens flanking the square were beneath even his contempt. His eyes lifted once toward the well's highest spire, a brief glance like a hand brushing dust from a sleeve, and for a moment Ryan wondered if Valor could see him there in the shadows. The gates opened before the Emperor reached them, an ancient courtesy written into the well's architecture. He entered without pause, his court fanning out behind him like the tail of a predatory bird. No one spoke until the echo of booths faded into the upper galleries. Then, from the side corridors, the 50 freed blades stepped into view. They wore no imperial insignia now, no masks of anonymity, only the plain clothing scavenged from markets and villages during their flight from obedience. The Emperor stopped when he saw them, one eyebrow lifting a fraction. I sent you to kill a man, he said, voice low but carrying, and you return not only alive but disarmed. Explain yourselves. The nearest blade stepped forward, a young woman with hair cut unevenly as though freedom had given her hands better things to do than grooming. We were ordered to silence a voice, she said steadily. Instead we learned we had our own. A murmur passed through the courtiers. Valor studied the row of them like a mathematician confronted with a remainder where none should exist. Then his gaze slid past them to the great doors of the inner vault where Ryan now appeared, descending the stair with the unhurried stride of someone who knows the play has reached the part where the music swells. Your Majesty, Ryan called, projecting his voice to the highest rafters, welcome to the Well of Names. Please enjoy your stay. There will be tea afterward if nobody dies. The courtiers bristled at the insolence, but Valor only regarded him with the faintest amusement. You invited me here with riddles, the Emperor said. You returned my assassins carrying mouths instead of knives. And now you offer tea. What is it you want, human? Ryan reached the center of the hall where light from the vaulted ceiling spilled across the floor in pale rivers. I want, he said, for your empire to hear what it has tried very hard to forget. At his gesture, Penny activated the projectors hidden along the walls. The air shimmered and filled with images pulled from the freed blades' cranial cores, villages burned under imperial banners, songs censored into silence, names erased from census records as though entire bloodlines had been clerical errors. Voices overlapped in a rising tide, testimonies of people who had learned too late that history was being edited with fire. The 50 blades stood like living punctuation marks in the story, their faces no longer blank but crowded with memory. The courtiers shifted uneasily as if the marble floor had grown soft beneath them. Vaylor alone remained still, watching the cascade of images with the faint curiosity of a man examining weather from indoors. When the last voice faded, he spoke into the hush. You think this spectacle unmasks me? I think it begins to, Ryan said. But the real unmasking comes now. Lyra stepped forward then, carrying the data leaf she had stolen from the Imperial archives. She handed it to Ryan, who held it up so the projectors could read its contents aloud. The hall filled with the ancient recording of voices layered into one, the architects of the sable throne speaking across centuries. A single will from many minds, it declared. A mask to endure where faces fail. The Empire shall wear humanity because humanity endures. Gasps scattered the court. Ryan let the words hang before turning back to Vaylor. You are not a man. You are a chorus pretending to be a solo. A council stitched from the conquered wearing the story of a human king because people like crowns better than committees. For the first time something flickered behind Vaylor's eyes, not anger exactly but the shadow of it passing close by. He reached up, unfastened a clasp behind his ear, and removed the seamless mask of flesh covering his face. Beneath was not bone nor metal but shifting light, features sliding from one shape to another too quickly to name. A dozen expressions surfaced and sank in seconds, a woman laughing, a child weeping, a soldier grim with orders. The courtiers recoiled though none dared speak. This is what victory made of us, the voices said together, each syllable a chord of layered tones. We conquered until there was nothing left to conquer and found ourselves alone, so we became one to survive our own ambition. And then you crowned yourselves, Ryan said softly, because tyranny loves a familiar silhouette. Vaylor replaced the mask with deliberate calm. What would you have me do, human? Dismantle the only order this galaxy has known because you dislike the face it wears. I would have you open the doors you locked, Ryan answered. Let the worlds speak to each other without your throne translating everything into obedience. The Emperor looked at Lyra then, his daughter standing rigid beside Ryan. So this betrayal is yours. She met his gaze without flinching. It is not betrayal to show people the truth, she said. It is only betrayal if you fear what they will do with it. Silence stretched until Penny broke it from the upper balconies, her voice echoing through the speakers. Imperial reinforcements inbound, she reported. 10 minutes out. If anyone intends to make history today, now would be excellent timing. Vaylor studied the faces around him, the court he had ruled, the soldiers who had defected, the daughter who defied him, the man who had turned assassination into invitation. Perhaps he saw in them the limits of crowns and masks, or perhaps only inevitability. Very well, he said at last. Show me this key you believe can open the galaxy. Ryan held up the small cylindrical device. One touch from me and the navigation lattice obeys a new master, he said. Borders will fall. Fleets will answer to no throne. Worlds will speak without permission. And if I refuse, Vaylor asked? Then, Ryan said, we all wait here together for the reinforcements to arrive and start shooting, which seems like a waste of a perfectly good afternoon. The Emperor considered, mask hiding whatever calculations moved behind it. Finally he stepped aside, a gesture small as a breath yet large enough to tilt the future. Proceed, he said. Let us see if a human hand can truly rewrite what so many minds built. The inner vault opened with the reluctance of something built to last longer than regret. Stone and alloy shifted aside, revealing a chamber that had not heard footsteps in centuries. At its center rose the pedestal, a column of metal veined with faint blue light, waiting like an instrument that only one musician remembered how to play. The air inside smelled of dust and ozone, as if time itself had been stored here and was not pleased about being disturbed. Ryan stepped forward slowly, the small cylindrical root key warm in his hand, while Lyra watched him with the tension of someone who had spent her life protecting knowledge now about to be set loose. Behind them the freed blades formed a semicircle, their faces unreadable in the glow. Above, the sound of approaching reinforcements rolled like distant thunder through the well's stone corridors. Penny reported that Imperial troops were minutes away, her voice crisp but carrying the faint static of signal interference as she jammed incoming orders. The courtiers who had followed the Emperor inside pressed back against the walls, torn between loyalty and the dawning realization that history did not ask for permission before rearranging itself. Valor entered last, the Emperor's mask hiding whatever expression might have lived beneath it. He moved to the edge of the chamber with the calm of a man attending his own trial. The freed blades watched him warily, but he made no motion toward the weapons at his belt. He seemed content to let the scene unfold, as though curious what kind of ending he had walked into. His court stood behind him in a ragged arc, silks and armor glinting faintly in the vault light. No one spoke until Lyra's voice broke the silence. "The key listens for a name," she said, words steady but her hands tight at her sides. "The old engineers designed it so only someone human could wake it. A safeguard against exactly this, against masks and councils and the weight of too many minds in one throne." She glanced at Ryan. "It will ask you to speak before it opens the lattice." Ryan stared at the pedestal, the blue veins pulsing faintly like a heart beneath frost. "And then it obeys me?" he asked quietly. "It obeys the choice you make," Lyra answered. The Emperor tilted his head slightly. "And if he chooses badly?" "Then we all live with that," she said. "Or we do not live at all." Outside the vault the first sounds of conflict began to filter down the corridors, muffled shouts, the crack of energy weapons as the reinforcements clashed with the freed blades stationed at the outer gates. The soldiers inside shifted uneasily, hands near triggers, waiting for orders the Emperor did not give. Ryan approached the pedestal, each step loud in the charged air. He placed the root key into the narrow slot at its center. The chamber lights flared once, and then dimmed as the device woke with a low hum that seemed to settle into the bones of everyone present. A voice rose from the pedestal, not mechanical but weary, carrying the cadence of centuries. "Speak the name of the one who asks," it said, "and the lattice shall answer." Ryan hesitated, feeling the weight of 50 worlds pressing down on the back of his neck. Then he said his name aloud, each syllable clear enough to cut stone. The device pulsed brighter. "It knows you," Lyra murmured. "The old systems remember their makers." The voice spoke again. "Speak the shape of the world you wish to make." Ryan looked back at the Emperor standing motionless by the wall, at Lyra with her fists clenched white, at the freed blades who had once been weapons and now waited to become witnesses. He thought of the villages erased from maps, the songs buried in ash, the long silence of people taught to obey before they learned to speak. "I want a world with doors instead of walls," he said finally. "A world where no one needs a throne to talk to their neighbor." The device processed this in silence so long it seemed to stretch time thin. Then the light running through its veins surged upward, spilling across the ceiling in lines that mapped themselves into the star lattice, the entire network of gates and routes tying the Empire together. Everyone in the chamber watched as the lines began to shift, breaking from the single point of the capital, weaving instead into a web with no center. Borders dissolved. Fleets rerouted. Whole sectors lit up with new connections bypassing the Imperial strongholds. The courtiers gasped like spectators at the collapse of a familiar landmark. The Emperor alone remained still, though his hands had curled slightly at his sides. "You break the unity that held this galaxy together," he said, voice low but carrying. "No," Ryan answered, watching the map rewrite itself above them. "I am giving it back to the people you took it from." The device's voice rose once more. "The lattice is rewritten. The choice is sealed." Outside the vault the fighting faltered as the new routes reached ships mid-battle, cutting them off from Imperial commands. Whole fleets vanished from enemy channels, redirected to neutral coordinates by a system that no longer recognized the throne. The reinforcements pressing toward the well hesitated as their targeting data collapsed into static. Confusion spread faster than orders could keep up. Lyra stepped beside Ryan, staring up at the new map glowing across the vault ceiling. "It looks like a net," she whispered. "No center. No crown. Just connections." "That is the point," he said. The Emperor moved forward at last, stopping beside the pedestal. He looked up at the shifting lights painting his mask in pale fire. "When we built the throne," he said slowly, "we believed unity required one will. One voice. One face for the galaxy to follow. We thought people feared chaos more than they hated chains." "You were half right," Ryan said. Vela regarded him for a long moment, then turned to Lyra. "And you, daughter? What will you do with this world you have cracked open?" She met his gaze steadily. "Teach it its own history. So it does not make you again." The mask hid whatever expression crossed the Emperor's features then. Perhaps regret. Perhaps only calculation finding no purchase on the smooth surface of change. He inclined his head slightly toward Ryan. "The throne will not survive this." "It was never supposed to," Ryan said. The freed blades began moving through the corridors, spreading the news that the lattice no longer obeyed Imperial command. Soldiers lowered their weapons as messages from their fleets confirmed the truth. The courtiers backed toward the exits like people leaving a theater after realizing the play had ended differently than they expected. Above the vault the map stabilized into its final form, a web of stars without hierarchy, glowing like a constellation no emperor could redraw. The device went dark, its work finished, the root key ejecting softly into Ryan's hand. Outside, the fighting ceased entirely as the last Imperial forces realized their orders could not find them anymore. Ships hung silent in the upper atmosphere, waiting for instructions no throne could deliver. On the plaza the wind carried dust across banners already looking uncertain of their purpose. Ryan turned from the pedestal to face the Emperor one last time. "You can stay," he said quietly. "Help build what comes next. Or you can cling to what just ended and be buried with it." The Empire did not collapse in fire the way most people expected. It unraveled the way cloth does when one thread is pulled too far, slowly at first, almost delicately, as if reluctant to admit it was happening at all. Worlds that had lived centuries under the shadow of the throne woke to find fleets gone silent, governors with no orders to obey, taxes no longer flowing toward a capital that could not even call them. Markets opened to neighbors once labeled enemies, ships crossed borders that no longer existed, and the long stifled conversations of planets began again with the clumsy eagerness of people rediscovering their own voices. Some places threw down imperial statues with cheers, others simply repainted them and called it thrift. Not everything changed at once. Some governors tried to keep power under new names, some admirals declared themselves kings of single systems. But the network no longer obeyed any center, and without the lattice the old empire was only a memory looking for a body. On the moon of the Well of Names a council formed almost by accident. Lyra found herself its reluctant chair, though she refused every title offered. Archivist General was the only one she accepted because it promised work rather than authority. She oversaw the first gatherings of delegates from newly freed worlds, watching as they argued over trade routes and water rights with the ferocity once reserved for rebellions. It was messy and often absurd. One planet demanded reparations paid entirely in goats. Another insisted the galaxy standard calendar be reset to year one so history could start fresh. Lyra let them fight because arguments meant people expected to be heard now, and that was new enough to be precious. The freed blades scattered across the stars like seeds shaken from a long-closed pod. Some returned to the villages they had once been ordered to burn, arriving with awkward apologies and unexpected farming skills. Others took work as mechanics, teachers, traders, anything that did not require obedience. A few could not stop being soldiers overnight, and offered their services to protect trade convoys from pirates who had wasted no time filling the power vacuum left behind. One blade opened a plum orchard on Tursin where the market fires had once burned hottest, insisting fruit was better company than emperors. Vela remained on the moon for weeks after the throne dissolved, a figure half shunned and half worshipped by people unsure what to do with him. He attended no councils, gave no speeches, wore no crown. Sometimes he walked the archives alone, studying the histories his own regime had censored. Other times he stood at the edge of the plaza watching ships depart through gates that no longer reported to him. When asked what he planned to do, he said only that masks grew heavy after centuries and he wished to see who he was without one. Ryan avoided most of the councils, claiming bureaucracy gave him hives. He spent days repairing the hinge with tools borrowed from delegates who suspected he would steal them but lent them anyway because he had become a kind of legend. Penny supervised the repairs with the tone of someone running both a ship and a particularly stubborn household. She also began drafting what she called the Common Protocols, a set of agreements for communication between worlds now that no single authority controlled the gates. Her documents were dry enough to make readers cry, but trade ships and diplomats quickly realized nothing moved without her schedules, and so Penny accidentally became one of the most powerful voices in the new Confederation, while complaining constantly about how disorganized everyone else was. When the first formal gathering of the Confederation of Names convened in the plaza outside the well, delegates argued for 3 hours over whether to call it a confederation, a concord, or simply the big meeting. Lyra finally ended the debate by opening the archives and reading aloud the oldest surviving treaty between two pre-imperial planets, a document written on bark promising friendship in exchange for beer recipes. If they managed with 1 page and a handshake, she told the delegates, so can we. The Confederation was declared with less ceremony than most weddings, but couriers carried the news across the stars and people began using the name before anyone voted on it. Ryan attended the signing mostly because Lyra threatened to assign him to a subcommittee on waste management if he did not. He stood at the back eating stolen fruit while the first charter was read aloud, a document full of phrases like mutual recognition and cooperative defense, and open routes policy. It sounded nothing like the ringing declarations of the old empire, and that was the point. No thrones. No crowns. Just agreements people could argue about later without getting executed. After the ceremony, Vaylor approached Ryan in the crowd. The former emperor looked thinner, as if centuries of command had been armor now stripped away. He studied the bustle of delegates around them before speaking. You could have taken the throne for yourself, he said quietly. The lattice would have obeyed you after you rewrote it. Ryan shrugged. I do not like chairs that much. Power like that tempts anyone, Vaylor said. It tempts people who want to be obeyed, Ryan replied. I just wanted doors to open. Vaylor considered this as though testing the weight of the words. Then he nodded once and walked away, disappearing into the departing crowd like a man finally willing to be ordinary. Weeks passed. Trade ships began running regular routes through gates once reserved for imperial fleets. Messages traveled faster than rumors for the first time in living memory. Schools opened where garrisons had once stood. Delegates returned to their worlds with more arguments than instructions, which everyone agreed was progress. One evening Ryan stood on the balcony of the well watching the stars pulse along the newly rewired lattice. Lyra joined him carrying 2 cups of tea and the exhausted look of someone who had spent the day convincing 3 planets not to declare war over mining rights. Do you think it will last? She asked, handing him a cup. Nothing lasts, Ryan said. But maybe this time things begin instead of end. Penny interrupted over the calm, announcing she had scheduled the next council session for 2 days hence, and that Ryan was legally required to attend because she had filed the paperwork herself. He groaned but knew better than to argue with a machine now running half the galaxy's communications out of sheer irritation at everyone else's incompetence. The last time the Confederation Council met before Ryan's departure, the delegates presented him with a map of the lattice engraved on metal, each line representing a gate now free to open without imperial permission. He accepted it awkwardly, muttered something about not being good at speeches, and escaped before anyone could insist on applause. Not long after, the hinge lifted from the moon's surface carrying Ryan, Penny, and coordinates Lyra had given him from deep in the archives. They pointed toward a cluster of distant worlds where old signals suggested humanity might have survived in pockets unknown to the Empire. Ryan said he was only going to look. Lyra smiled like someone who knew better.